10. The game don't stop. I can sleep when I die. Young Jeezy. When Eric Slim Bivens saw the flashing blue lights rushing up behind the rental car, he knew it meant trouble. The car reeked of weed. Plus, there was a shitload of jewelry in the rental, which might look a little suspicious. But Slim wasn't sweating it. As far as he knew, this was a run-of-the-mill traffic stop. He didn't think for a second that the stop was anything but a minor inconvenience. His boss, Terry, who was beside him in the car, would know how to handle it. As Terry's right-hand man, Slim traveled nearly everywhere with him. They met back in 2000, and in 5 short years, Slim had climbed the ranks from entry-level drug distributor to BMF underboss. His position in Terry's drug organization was almost as lofty as Meech's had been before the brothers split. Slim wasn't an equal partner to Terry, but he was still way up there. His primary responsibilities were to keep track of BMF's drivers as they hauled cash and cocaine across the country, and to make sure the couriers got paid and the distributors paid up. Most important, though, Slim could be counted on to do as Terry told him. Slim was a yes man. And on July 11, 2005, when Slim and Terry were pulled over in the rental car, that trait came in handy. Slim knew that most of the jewelry in the car was from Terry's personal collection, and that it had been bound for a Young Jeezy video shoot in St. Louis. Terry claimed to be tight with Sean P. Diddy Combs, the owner of the label that had signed Jeezy's rap collective. Jeezy's solo deal was with another label, Def Jam. At the very least, the Kingpin was indirectly linked to the music mogul in several ways. Terry employed Diddy's cousin, Daryl Papa Taylor, who'd been hired under the pretense of working at 404 Motorsports, the company belonging to Kiki Graham in which Terry had invested $250,000. Rather than work for 404, though, Papa became one of Terry's drug couriers, and recently had been promoted to a major distributor. Another of Terry's cocaine associates was a man who'd introduced Papa to Terry, Diddy's chief of security, Paul Buford. Paul held the job under Diddy that once belonged to Wolf Jones, who was killed behind Club Chaos. So, it was nothing out of the ordinary for one of Diddy's guys to call Terry and request a favor. And in this case, it was Paul requesting the use of his impressive array of diamond-encrusted watches and multiple carat pendants. Paul asked Terry if he'd travel to St. Louis from L.A. and bring whatever bling he could spare. Young Jeezy needed a little more sparkle for his shoot. In July 2005, Terry and Slim, carrying $5 million in jewelry, boarded a private jet in L.A., where they both lived, and flew to their hometown Detroit, where they had one of their cocaine couriers pick them up in a BMF van. From there, the three of them drove 9 hours to St. Louis. Once they arrived, however, they learned that the video shoot had been canceled. Hoping to prevent the trip from being a total waste, Terry made other arrangements. He decided that he and Slim would drive to Cleveland to meet up with Corey Fuller, the former NFL defensive back. The plan was to do a little gambling. So they left the van and the courier behind and had another drug associate rent them a car in St. Louis. A third associate was enlisted to drive them to Cleveland. They were barely out of the St. Louis suburbs, crossing through Bond County, Illinois, when the patrol car's blue lights flashed in the rearview mirror. The trooper asked them about the strong smell wafting from the vehicle. Terry and Slim admitted to smoking weed in the car. He asked for their licenses, and they handed over fake IDs. He searched them and found 21 cell phones, and in Terry's pocket, $4,000 in crisp $50 bills. Finally, the trooper discovered nearly 24 pieces of wildly opulent jewelry. Terry needed to come up with a story about the origin of the bling, fast. He couldn't claim it as his own. How could he explain why he, with no verifiable income, possessed a fortune in diamonds? The jewelry was confiscated, and the 3 occupants of the car were driven to the sheriff's office. After sitting down with the trooper, Terry agreed to give a statement. He admitted that the licenses were fakes. He said they only carried the false ID to distance themselves from his brother, Demetrius Big Meech Flannery, who tended to attract trouble. Terry said he didn't want anything to do with his brother, from whom he had been estranged for more than a year. Terry also said the jewelry wasn't his. He said his friend in L.A., a successful music producer named Damon Thomas, had bought or rented all the pieces. Terry went so far as to tell the cops where Damon had gotten the jewelry: the ritzy New York boutique, Jacob & Company, owned by celebrity's king of bling, Jacob Arabo. Jacob was known in hip-hop and Hollywood circles as simply Jacob the Jeweler. And his iconic designs, big, flashy, and colorful, were one of high society's ultimate status symbols. In fact, Terry told his interrogator the pieces of jewelry in question were to be props in a video shoot. He said he was merely delivering them to the set on behalf of their actual owner. After Terry's interrogation was over, he instructed Slim to repeat the story he just told with a few extra flourishes. Terry told Slim that he needed to present himself as a music producer, a colleague of Damon Thomas's. "Tell them you make beats for a living," Terry said. "Tell them you earn $150,000 per year. That might help deflect attention away from Slim and Terry's true profession." Slim had no problem following his boss's orders, and he wasn't at all worried about what would happen if he lied. No way, he thought, was the government on to them. They were just going through the motions of a traffic stop. Slim and Terry's story appeared to have convinced the cops. Once the questioning was over, the troopers acted satisfied with what they heard. They kept the jewelry to be sure the story behind the diamonds checked out, and they let the men go. Once they were back on the road to Cleveland, Terry called his friend Damon Thomas in L.A. He told Damon that he needed him to jump through a few hoops. Terry wanted Damon to create a fake paper trail to support the illusion that the jewelry belonged to him. That way, Terry could send Damon to Illinois to claim the bling. Terry already had laid the foundation for the ruse. Terry's assurances to the officers, coupled with Slim's story about being a music producer himself, would make the whole incident seem less suspicious. Of course, to produce a kind of paperwork showing that Damon was the actual owner of the diamonds, Jacob the Jeweler had to be involved. That meant a trip to New York. Terry asked Damon if he could fly to the city for a meeting with Jacob the following day. The two of them would need to sit down with the jeweler and come up with a plan. Damon said he'd be there. Slim and Terry spent the night in Cleveland. The next day, they flew by private jet to New York and booked a room at the Swiss Hotel on Park Avenue. The meeting with Jacob would take place at a hotel. Jacob's wife wasn't crazy about Terry showing up at Jacob's Upper East Side jewelry store. After Damon and Jacob arrived at Terry's suite, Slim stepped out of the room to give them some privacy. Once the meeting was over, Terry filled him in on the details. He said Jacob had agreed to help him, and Damon retrieved the $5 million in bling that the authorities had taken. Jacob and Damon said they'd handle the paperwork. After the meeting, the two of them headed over to Jacob's home to figure out how they could lay claim to the 22 pieces of confiscated jewelry. They decided that the documentation for the majority of the pieces should show that the jewelry had been purchased by Damon. A few of the other pieces would be portrayed as loaners, items that, though consigned to Damon, technically belonged to Jacob. That way, Damon could request a return of most of the jewelry, and Jacob could claim the rest. With the details hashed out, the two men left Jacob's house and went to his Upper East Side store, where Jacob drafted a memo dated June 21, 2005, 3 weeks earlier. The memo stated that Jacob and Company had lent 5 pieces of jewelry to Damon Thomas on that date, and that each of the pieces had value between $95,000 and $420,000. As further evidence that Damon owned the jewelry, Jacob pulled copies of 6 checks that Damon actually had written him over the past year. On those occasions, as with this one, Damon had come to Terry's aid. Federal law requires that retailers file a form with the IRS anytime they conduct a cash transaction over $10,000. Terry wasn't cool with the forms being in his name. He didn't want to draw the Fed's attention to his spending habits. So, he had given Damon the cash for a few pieces he wanted for his collection, and Damon wrote several personal checks to Jacob, checks that Jacob now would use in an effort to fool the authorities. Several weeks after Jacob the Jeweler drafted the fake memo, he had it on hand when 2 DEA agents called on him at Jacob and Company. The DEA had arranged a meeting with Jacob's consent. They told him that the authorities in Illinois had confiscated some jewelry during a traffic stop, but they didn't get into any details. So, the agents were surprised when, upon arriving at the super slick jewelry store fashioned to look like the inside of a space-age diamond mine, Damon Thomas's file was sitting on a table, waiting for them. One of the agents asked Jacob how he knew which file to pull. Jacob, always cool, always collected, told the agent he received a phone call from Damon Thomas shortly after the jewelry had been seized on an Illinois highway, and that Damon was eager to get his diamonds back. so Jacob figured he'd help speed things along. Jacob pulled from Damon's file the fake memo dated June 21st, 2005, and handed it to the agents. Jacob then handed over several other documents from the file. He gave the agents invoices for 9 of the 22 pieces of confiscated jewelry. Those invoices showed that Damon had purchased the pieces in 2004 and early 2005. Jacob also produced the 6 cleared checks written to him by Damon over the past year, totaling over $700,000. The checks were the clincher. They'd been written to Jacob months earlier and were drawn from Damon's account, evidence that the bank would be able to verify. The agents asked Jacob if he'd ever sold any pieces to Terry Flannery. Jacob told them that he was in fact familiar with Terry Flannery, a heavy-set black gentleman who typically accompanied Damon when he came by the shop, but he said he'd never sold any jewelry to him, certainly not. The agents sat back and let Jacob try to convince them of his story, but they already knew something was up. A year earlier, in August 2004, the feds intercepted several phone calls between Terry Flannery and Damon Thomas. Over the wire, the agents heard the two men discussing a jewelry deal. Terry had asked Damon if he could write a few checks in Terry's behalf to Jacob the jeweler. So, when the DEA began investigating the jewelry that the troopers found in the rental car, they suspected Terry was trying to trick them. And now, it appeared that both Jacob and Damon were in on it too. In addition to the intercepted phone calls, the feds had other evidence pointing to the cover-up. Federal banking records showed that in the summer of 2004, 2 weeks before the first intercepted call, Damon Thomas deposited $215,000 cash into his checking account. Judging from what was said on the phone, the cash came from Terry. Sure enough, 3 days after the money was deposited, Damon wrote Jacob the jeweler a check for the same amount, $215,000. A short time later, Damon deposited another $150,000, presumably from Terry, and wrote Jacob another check for $150,000. Now Jacob was presenting those checks to the agents, trying to pass them off as something they weren't. Little did he know that, far from helping Terry, he was strengthening the federal investigation into Black Mafia family. On July 26, 2005, 2 weeks after Slim and Terry's traffic stop, Young Jeezy's major label debut, Let's Get It, Thug Motivation 101, was released, and the Atlanta rapper was met with instant mainstream success. In its first week, Let's Get It sold 172,000 copies, earning it a number 2 spot on Billboard's top-selling albums chart. It eventually would go platinum, and in the eyes of music critics across the country, Jeezy was pure gold. In the months following the release, Jeezy was called a great rapper, your favorite rapper's favorite rapper, and a first-rate narrator. Lovable, although never quite trustworthy, the praise was equally effusive for Let's Get It, mesmerizing, brilliantly simple, endlessly entertaining. This is sly, insinuative music. According to a flattering review in the New York Times, the newspaper later christened Let's Get It the best album of the year. With Let's Get It, Jeezy made good on his promise to acquaint the masses with the perils and poetry of street life. The album made frequent and unapologetic references to the drug game, and t-shirts emblazoned with Jeezy's mascot, a menacing snowman, were selling like crazy, thanks in part by the publicity they generated when several school districts across the country banned them for being a blatant reference to cocaine. That summer also saw the release of BMF Entertainment's lifestyle magazine, The Juice, which hit the streets with far less hoopla. Though stylish, there was little substance to the publication, and virtually no advertising. The glossy, dual covers, Meech was featured on one side, Jeezy on the other, mostly served as a prop in photo shoots, promotional DVDs, and music videos, including the one for Jeezy's hit single, Soul Survivor. The song has a chilly, stoical quality. Over the backdrop of tinny synthesizers, Jeezy's dark and breathless rasp is offset by the more ethereal flow of guest rapper Akon, a Singhalese MC who delivers a chorus that rivals the rawest of street anthems. Everybody know the game don't stop, trying to make it to the top, or your ass gets popped. The lyrics paint a grim and realistic picture of the drug game that Meech all but perfected. And as with virtually every other line of the track, it could just as well have been Meech speaking. The video for the song follows a narrative in which Jeezy, earning a living at a dry cleaning business, stumbles upon a drug deal gone bad. He snatches a backpack full of cash belonging to the gun-down distributor. He then begins slinging full-time, only to end up the victim of a fate similar to the backpack's original owner, the difference being that Jeezy survives the attack on his life. Toward the end of the video, the camera pans over a crowd congregating on a bleakly lit street corner. All of a sudden, the camera pauses. It fixates on a man wearing a white t-shirt and white baseball cap, a telltale diamond cross swinging from his neck. As Big Meech turns slowly to face the camera, he seems to be gazing far beyond his surroundings. His distant expression appears to be locked on what lies ahead, as if he knew, at that moment, that the spotlight would be shining on him for the last time. Meech knew that for years investigators had been following him, and he always believed he was one step ahead of them. Stay off the phone. Don't get caught with the package. Surround yourself with associates who would always remain loyal. Those were his rules, but they weren't enough. By the fall of 2005, the FBI and IRS had joined the DEA in its investigation into the Black Mafia family, and they were keeping a closer watch on Meech than ever. At that point, Meech knew he was putting on a show. He realized he was guilty of living too large, but he didn't think it mattered. He still thought he was invincible. As 2005 wore on, and Jeezy began performing at larger and larger arenas for crowds that began to number in the thousands, he paid frequent homage to one source of his inspiration. Before launching into his first verse of Soul Survivor, he'd press his lips to the mic and shout out a dedication to Big Meech. All the while, the song climbed higher and higher in the charts, debuting at a modest 84 before rising all the way to the top 10, including a #1 spot on Billboard's radio monitor. And as Jeezy's career began to soar, Meech's started to implode. The investigation into the Black Mafia family didn't hinge on a certain pivotal event. It wasn't precipitated by one dramatic bust or a single miscalculated move or a particular lapse in judgment. Rather, it was brought on by years of painstaking surveillance, fastidious police work, and incremental victories. As the Alphabet Boys' investigation neared its conclusion, the hunt was drawing to a close, but the game was far from over. Meech and Terry's influence remained strong, and BMF's myth was only just beginning. In October 2005, a team of federal agents that included members of the DEA, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and the U.S. Marshal Service traveled from Atlanta to Texas on the trail of a wanted man. The agents had received a tip that their suspect was living in a $1.7 million home in a wealthy Dallas suburb. The 6,500-square-foot modernist mansion was a big blockish expanse of asymmetrical windows and angular roof lines, a home as ostentatious as its suspected occupant. Upon their arrival at the house, the agents set up surveillance outside. They didn't have to wait long to see if their tip checked out. They watched as the man they were hunting arrived at the house and disappeared inside. The team kept an eye out on the house late into the night and early the next morning, staking it out from several angles. Sometime before 10 a.m., they noticed the suspect emerge from the back door and step into the yard. Standing next to the shimmering pool, he lit up a blunt and took a few deep morning drags. Minutes later, the team made its move. Agents burst through the front door of the house and announced their presence in a rapid-fire series of exclamations. "Police! Don't move! Search warrant! You're under arrest!" They swept through the home, footsteps pounding from room to room. There wasn't much chance for the 3 occupants to run. 2 of them didn't need to. The agents were interested in only one person inside the house, Demetrius Big Meech Flannery. Meech had been arrested several times before, and for the most part, he didn't give up easily. When police went looking for him after the Chaos killings, they caught up with him only because he was stuck at the hospital, being treated for a bullet wound to the buttock. When he'd been snared in a roadblock outside the strip club pinups, he gave a fake name to throw the police off his trail, and after he was detained, took a piss on the interrogation room's wall. Another time, when he and J-Bo were pulled over in his Bentley in the parking lot of his club, Babylon, J-Bo was asked to step out of the vehicle, and Meech jumped into the driver's seat and hit the gas. But this arrest was different. This time, Meech submitted quietly, and he let the tide take him. As a team of agents swarmed the house, a sure sign that the feds meant business, Meech kept his composure intact and his mouth shut. He would soon have other battles to fight. After Meech was cuffed, more investigators were called to the house to help conduct a search. The mansion had been equipped for a battle that never happened. Guns were strategically placed in several locations. A loaded .40 caliber in the kitchen cabinet next to the stove, tucked alongside a stack of business cards with Meech's name. A semi-automatic with bullets that could breach a Kevlar vest, secured in a safe in the master bedroom closet. 2 more pistols stashed in the attic, which would have been a decent hiding place if Meech decided to secret himself away. The 24 law enforcement agents also uncovered bags of weed in the upstairs closet and in the kitchen, a heap of diamond jewelry on the kitchen counter, 4 necklaces, 2 watches, 2 pairs of diamond earrings, and a bracelet, $10,000 in cash, and a handful of ecstasy pills in the nightstand drawer of the master bedroom, and Meech's silver Bentley in the garage. Meech ostensibly was arrested on a warrant filed a week earlier in Atlanta. The warrant charged him with possession of a firearm and possession of marijuana, offenses stemming from the year-old search of Space Mountain. It seemed doubtful, however, that a team of federal agents would track him to his Texas retreat on such low-key allegations, especially ones that investigators sat around and waited a year to file. No, there definitely was something bigger at play, and Meech would have to sit in a Texas county jail for 8 days before he learned what was really going on. A week after Meech's takedown, a team of DEA agents and U.S. Marshals descended on a quiet middle-class suburb 10 miles north of St. Louis. They approached an unpretentious home at the end of a curving driveway on Jamestown Farm Road. The house sat in the middle of a clearing bordered by dense woods on one side and a sprawling wheat field on the other. The homeowner was Danny Dogman Jones, a suspected BMF drug distributor in St. Louis. Even from outside the house, the federal agents could smell the weed. They knocked on the front door and heard what sounded like a crowd of people scurrying from room to room, yelling that the police were outside. The agents didn't wait for an answer. They busted through the door, interrupting what appeared to be a party. A table to the right of the door was strewn with playing cards and cash, evidence of a gambling game rudely interrupted. In the bedroom, the agents found even more money, $600,000 stacked in neat piles. In addition to Dogman, who was hosting the gathering, the agents caught up with 15 other BMF members, Terry's childhood friend and trusted Detroit manager, Benjamin Blank Johnson, another of Terry's top managers, Derek Chip Tooth Pegues, his girlfriend's grown son, Marlon Lil Dog Welch, whom Terry treated as one of his own, 3 of the organization's drivers and drug couriers, and 9 other associates. The agents also came face-to-face with Terry's Southwest T. Flannery. The day after Terry's arrest, on October 28, 2005, a 28-page, 11-count indictment was unsealed in federal court in Detroit. The case had been filed in Detroit partly for symbolic reasons. Though Meech and Terry had moved the heart of their operation to L.A. and Atlanta, Detroit was the birthplace of their Black Mafia family. It was the brothers' childhood home. Meech was charged with 7 counts and Terry with 9. The most serious of them was the allegation that the Flannery brothers ran a continuing criminal enterprise. Like the more commonly used RICO statute, racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations, the CCE law was created to tackle organized crime. Both RICO and CEE charges are used to target long-term, elaborate criminal enterprises that operate like businesses. The difference is that a RICO case is brought against leaders of the organizations who oversee a number of activities, including gambling, prostitution, bribery, and counterfeiting. A CCE case, on the other hand, can be brought only against drug traffickers, and the charge is reserved for the most serious of them. Of all the drug cases the feds investigate, only 1% ends up being a CCE prosecution. To get a CCE conviction, prosecutors must prove that the defendant was the boss of at least 5 subordinates, that he oversaw at least 3 related drug offenses, and that he earned a substantial amount of money from the organization. The other major difference between a RICO and a CCE charge is that while a RICO conviction is typically punishable by a maximum 20-year sentence, a CCE conviction guarantees 20 years to life. In addition to the Flannery brothers, 23 of their associates were indicted on lesser charges, most of them on Terry's side. 11 distributors and 10 drivers were charged with conspiracy to distribute cocaine, as was Terry's longtime girlfriend, Tanessa Welch. Many of the defendants were also charged with money laundering. Among the indicted were Chip Tooth Pegues and Blank Johnson, Blank's brother, Arnold A.R. Boyd, who had replaced Blank as Terry's Detroit manager, Calvin Playboy Sparks, who'd been caught on a wiretap in early 2004 talking with Terry about his recent roadside arrest on 9 kilos of cocaine. Christopher Pig Triplett, who'd been arrested along with Playboy and whom Playboy had complained about during the wiretap call, and Jabari Hayes, who'd been pulled over days after Pig and Playboy in an RV loaded with more than 100 kilos of cocaine, worth an estimated $2 million wholesale and $10 million on the street. Because investigators were able to get a wire up on several of Terry's phones, he was charged with 3 counts of using a cell phone in violation of the U.S. Controlled Substance Act. Meech mistakenly was charged in one of those counts too. When Terry and Playboy had talked on the phone that day in May 2004, Terry had pretended to hand the phone over to Meech. In fact, he'd handed it to his right-hand man Slim, who did his best Meech impersonation. The feds who were listening in on the call believed that it was actually Meech on the phone. That charge was soon dropped. Surprisingly, Slim wasn't charged in the indictment. William Doc Marshall, BMF's chief financial officer and one of the few employees who continued to have contact with both Meech and Terry, was mentioned only in passing. And despite their lofty positions, none of Meech's top associates were indicted either. There was no mention in the indictment of Chad Jabo Brown, Meech's second-in-command, Fleming Ill Daniels, and Martez Tito Berth, who were directly below Jabo, or the rapper Barima Blue Da Vinci McKnight, one of Meech's most trusted confidants and cocaine distributors. Nor was there any indication that the feds thought Jeezy might be involved in Meech's criminal enterprise. The evidence laid out in the indictment was enough to provide a glimpse of the organization, but it did not provide the full picture. The document describes 8 cocaine busts that took place over the course of 6 years. A collective 500 kilos were seized, but one of those busts, the 250 kilos discovered inside the house on California's Oso Avenue, where Tremaine Kiki Graham had been arrested, didn't have anything to do with BMF. Though the coke likely came from the same supplier, that shipment belonged to Jerry J. Rock Davis's Sin City Mafia. The feds later struck that information from the indictment. That reduced the amount of cocaine mentioned in the indictment by half. None of the drugs was seized from Meech or Terry directly. And of the $3.9 million in cash that the feds claimed to have confiscated from BMF, none of that was seized from the Flannery brothers either. As with the cocaine, the amount of cash seized paled in comparison to what the feds believed the Flannerys had pulled in. Even by conservative estimates, Meech and Terry are believed to have earned, in the course of a decade, $270 million. As for the brothers' assets, proof that they'd seen substantial income from BMF, the evidence in the indictment stacked up much higher against Terry. Though both brothers had driven Bentleys, Lamborghinis, and Maybachs, the cars weren't registered in their names. But Terry did buy 3 cars using an alias the feds cracked: a Mercedes, a Range Rover, and a Chevy van. Terry also was linked through his girlfriend to 3 homes, the White House, and 2 of his 3 California residences. According to the indictment, the homes were titled to Tanessa, and she made $840,000 in payments on the California mortgages over 4 years. That averages out to $17,500 per month. Though Tanessa owned her own business, a high-end car shop, that the feds believed was one of Terry's fronts, she didn't make the kind of money to pay those mortgages. The feds believed she had help from Terry. The only asset the indictment linked to Meech was a house he'd rented in South Beach. But the lease wasn't in Meech's name, making it harder to prove that he was the one paying $30,000 monthly rent. Terry had been the understated brother, the careful one, the one who admonished the other for his extravagance. But in the end, the feds' case against Terry was far stronger than the one against Meech. The feds had Terry, not Meech, on a wiretap. They'd indicted many of Terry's associates and few of his brothers. Terry appeared to have substantial assets, while Meech had none. All of which meant that in order to build their case against Meech, prosecutors needed witnesses willing to take the stand against him, and they were hoping Terry would be one of them.